The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Michael Greger, the American physician, author, and professional speaker on public health issues, particularly the benefits of a whole food, plant-based diet. You've appeared in numerous documentary films, including What the Health, Eating You Alive, and most recently as scientific advisor on The Game Changers. Your 2015 book, How Not to Die, is a New York Times bestseller, and your upcoming book, How to Survive a Pandemic, explores the root causes of the outbreak and reveals how we can protect ourselves and our loved ones. Dr. Greger, welcome back to London Real.
I am so glad to be back.
It's great to have you here. Before we get started, I just wanted to announce to everybody that we are streaming now on our brand new Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Can everyone watching this right now please share it via the sidebar on any and all of your social media channels? Let me just repeat that. If everybody watching now could please share this on their sidebar to all of their social media channels. Just ask your friends and family to give us 15 minutes and we will take care of the rest. Dr. Greger, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anyone in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at londonreal.tv/Greger, thanks to the generous donations of over 31,000 people around the world that I affectionately call the London Real Army. For anybody wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can visit freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Dr. Greger, I'm super excited to have you here today. Who would have known that long before you were a plant-based advocate, you were an expert in viruses and you spent time in some of these wards and witnessed all of this. You've seemed to whip a book out from almost nowhere. And I wondered, maybe you can talk us through what you see that's happened in the past few months when it comes to the virus. From your perspective, you know, we've been talking about it almost nonstop for 9 weeks, sometimes being censored, sometimes not. But tell me, this is the last thing I expected.
Yeah, well, certainly not the last thing I expected. I've been expecting this for decades, shouting from the rooftops along with my fellow public health professionals. Yeah, the next pandemic is always a matter of when, not if. It's just when it's going to happen, how bad it's going to be. And we're actually looking at quite a mild pandemic compared to how it certainly could be in the future. But, you know, unfortunately, people weren't ready to listen. So before I had my career in lifestyle medicine, I was in infectious disease, public health director at HSUS in Washington, D.C., and on the front lines, and wrote a book back in 2006 on pandemic preparedness and prevention. I told people, get that toilet paper. It's all in the way back when. But no one was willing to listen. And so then I defaulted, all right, fine. Well, from 1919 to 2019, every single year for the last 100 years, the number one killer here in the States, heart disease. And so I'll move on that. All I'm interested in is saving lives, but always in the back of my mind, realizing that in 1918, that wasn't a leading killer because then it was pandemic flu, just as 2020 will have a different leading causes of death as well. And so this gave me the opportunity, as disappointing as it was, to stop my How Not to Diet tour, which I was so honored to be here on London Real for. Only got to about 50 out of the 200 cities I was going to. So was grounded, but that gave me an opportunity to go back and bring all this research that I had done previously, and to finally be able to kind of flex my intellectual muscle in that space. And so glad to have the book out. It's already out on audiobook, on ebook, How to Survive a Pandemic, and will be out in physical copies, both in the US and the UK in August.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I know you dedicate the book, I believe, to the Chinese doctor who was one of the kind of maybe whistleblowers, if you would, who kind of publicly blogged about this. I don't know if that was back in December or January. I'm sure you can walk me through the timeline. But when did you yourself notice something was amiss? When did you say, uh-oh, this is the thing that I've been thinking about for, say, 20 years?
Yeah, so I dedicate the book to Dr. Lee, who on December 30th was among the first to alert his colleagues about what appeared to be this first few cases of SARS pneumonia, the first deadly coronavirus outbreak of this century. But he was summoned by the Public Security Bureau, reprimanded for spreading rumors and making false statements that disturbed the public order. And sadly, 39 days later, after becoming infected with the very virus he was warning people about, he was dead at age 33. And by that time, the disease had already spread to dozens of countries. And had they not silenced the whistleblower, and in fact alerted the world earlier, we would not be facing the deadliest pandemic really in a century. But again, as pandemics go, the CDC, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, has a pandemic severity index similar to the hurricane severity index, categories 1 through 5. So COVID-19 is shaping up to be a category 2 pandemic with a case fatality rate under 0.5%. And so there's a lot. So this may just be kind of a dress rehearsal for an even greater pandemic threat coming for the future, which is what the bulk actually of my book is about, what we can do to prevent the emergence of even deadlier outbreaks in the future. But for me, anyone in the infectious disease space is on a listserv called ProMed, which has every human, animal, or plant disease outbreak anywhere in the world. And so every morning you see what new viruses and other pathogens are bubbling up around the world. And so we can see this very early on, but you never know. Is this just going to be another SARS, another MERS, another deadly coronavirus that can be squashed effectively? Because unlike influenza, you only became contagious after showing symptoms. That's a disease you can squash. You can do fever monitoring in airports, and they were able to crush SARS, only about 8,000 cases, around 800 deaths. And similarly with MERS, this Middle East respiratory syndrome. But little did we know that we could have a deadly human coronavirus where people could become infected and infectious before showing symptoms. So you can, days after becoming exposed to the virus, you could look perfectly fine, feel perfectly fine, but maybe exhaling virus with every breath. And without massive testing, you don't know who's infected, who's not, because you can be infectious without showing symptoms. So that's where these social distancing measures came from, because you just got to keep everybody away from everybody else since you don't know who exactly is infected. But in terms of personally, it really wasn't until early March where I canceled all my dates. And at that time, people were really upset, wondering why, they had booked these venues for months in advance or even a year in advance. And here I was canceling for some crazy thing that was only over in China. But I just kept telling them, you wait, give me a week. You'll see this was the right decision. And indeed, that was not the time to be traveling around internationally. But
you mentioned that.
Then it was a matter of just, all right, I got a book to write. Let's hunker down and do it.
How long did it take you to write the book?
This is all hands on deck kind of situation. So I just, at this point, I now have this research team, this massive research team, which I could just, turn the ship from looking at chronic disease and move it into the infectious disease realm. It's the same kind of research skills. And so in a matter of 6 weeks, We have this book, which comes out to be about 600 pages, 3,500 citations, and we're able to churn it out. And the only way we could do that is because I already had I already published extensively in the peer-reviewed scientific literature on these diseases. It's really just a matter of taking my science writing and converting it into kind of lay public, something that people could understand, and of course doing all the research on the new virus, which took up about 3 chapters. And so, but I felt this is the time we could use this opportunity as kind of a fire drill to wake us out of our complacency, kind of a dry run for the very real disease threats that could be coming down the pike.
Right, and you mentioned like the CDC. I think they just recently came out, but correct me if I'm wrong, and said it had like a 0.26 fatality rate. And I don't know if I'm right, but that's like definitely under the 0.5 that you mentioned. Whereas in the beginning, we had the Imperial College numbers from Niall Ferguson here that were, at one point projecting 2 million deaths in America. I remember when I first read those figures, maybe back in March, and I mean, that was a very difficult hour for me when I tried to contemplate those numbers. I had actually just forced myself to watch that Steven Soderbergh movie, Contagion, is that it? And so I literally just watched it before the lockdown, and so that's in my head. And I read, I think, a private, WhatsApp group to some physicians that later came out with those Imperial numbers, and it was a big shock to people at first when we first heard those numbers.
Right. And there's this kind of fog of war, in the beginning where you just don't know. So it all depends on the denominator, of course, right? We know how many people die, but there's still some inaccuracy with those numbers. But that's a much more hard endpoint. But of course, that's out of how many that are infected. And so you don't know unless you have proper testing in place. And so early on, we thought it was much more serious than it turned out to be. But, if you're going to either overreact or underreact, in that time of uncertainty, overreaction is safer because you can always dial down, or you would hope you could always dial down the governmental interventions. But you don't want to lose those precious days, weeks, and months in case we're really facing something that's much more serious.
Let me ask you a question. There was a New York Times kind of a video graphic they put out about the travel in and out of Wuhan around Chinese New Year. And I think it showed like 1 million people moved in and out of that city around that time, when we know at this point there were probably, non-symptom infected people. When you see something like that and then you see what happened to Dr. Lee, do you think, man, we really missed a chance to hold this back? Or does a virus like this get out sooner or later, even if you try a lot of things?
More than a third of the 14 million residents in Wuhan actually fled the region. Part of it because the lockdown in the city went into effect January 23rd. And so, when you announce a lockdown, and it was also Lunar New Year, it's a big holiday, people go back to their families. And so this was the time. Of course, when you do that, you just kind of, you spread it even further. So one could certainly argue, had local officials not wasted weeks silencing whistleblowers and releasing these false epidemic reports, the world very well could have been spared the pandemic. Though at the same time, the aggressive actions that China did subsequently take may have indeed bought us all some time. But because of exponential spread, unless you catch it really early, it's really impossible to stamp out. But since the risk of severe disease and death depends on our healthcare resource availability, if we have the time to scale up, to get the ventilators out of the national stockpile, a few days can make all the difference. We get the testing in place, and you can see some countries did remarkably well, like South Korea and Singapore and Taiwan. And part of the reason is because they had recently suffered deadly coronavirus disease outbreaks. SARS, South Korea had a big MERS outbreak in 2015, and so they were ready. They had the testing and tracing public health infrastructure in place, and they were able to jump on it And so look, if a few dozen deaths or hundreds of deaths can rally entire countries to a state of pandemic preparedness, well, then the thousands or even potentially millions of deaths from COVID-19 would hopefully reorient the countries of the world towards pandemic prevention as well.
Yeah, I definitely think, we got off a lot easier than we could have. I mean, look, I'm in London, the plague hit here pretty hard, back in the day. And, the other numbers we've seen, I mean, it could have been much worse. And you mentioned in your book, it could have been 1 in 2, not, 1 in, I don't know what 0.05 is, but not 2 in 1,000, I guess is what that is.
Right.
So it could have been much worse. I'll be honest, what we've been talking about here the last 9 weeks is so many different theories and so many different ideas, because I think the public from the beginning never really knew all the information, never knew who to trust. I mean, overall, how would you rate the entire world, the governments, the WHOs, the CDCs on a scale of 1 to 10 on how they handled this whole thing? Because, a lot of people still don't know what's going on. They don't know who to trust. They feel like maybe some of the things they did weren't necessary. Well, how do you rate that whole thing, doctor?
Well, look, you can just look at the numbers, right? I mean, the proof is in the pudding. And so let's look at, per capita death rates around the world. So you have countries like Taiwan. They last time I checked, they had 7 deaths. 7 out of a population of 23 million. Now, here in the States, right, we have, more than 10 times the population, but 1,000 times the deaths, right? Similar with Australia. Recently, they hit the landmark 100 deaths on the continent, 100 deaths after months. And so, whereas other countries did much more poorly in terms of getting the testing out there, even the messaging that was coming out. Of course, here the CDC flip-flopped on masks, on a number of issues, and even now, there's this hodgepodge of different localities doing, basically ignoring the science and just kind of going willy-nilly, and it's just, I think a really sad day for the role of science and public policy. Instead of listening to the experts, at least here in the States, rapidly politicized. And so, whereas here in the States, the CDC would have taken, at any other point in our history, would have taken the lead in terms of daily briefings and policy. They're the experts. They've been preparing for this for decades. Instead, they were silenced, suppressed. Recently, the comparison was made saying that you can't criticizing the CDC for how badly they handled this is like criticizing the swimming abilities of someone who had cemented around their ankles. It's like, they were unfortunately the powers that be here in the States. We're not interested in listening to what the experts had to say. But so thank God this was such a mild pandemic. You could imagine what the same kind of bumbling could have done in countries around the world had we been really facing a much deadlier pandemic. In fact, as you mentioned, as bad as COVID-19 has been, there may be much deadlier infectious disease threats waiting in the wings of chickens, right? According to the CDC, the leading candidate for the next pandemic is a bird flu virus by the name of H7N9, which is 100 times deadlier than COVID-19. Instead, 1 in 250 cases dying, H7N9 has killed 40% of the people infected, right? The last time a bird flu virus jumped species and triggered a human pandemic, it triggered the deadliest plague in human history, the 1918 pandemic, which killed 50 to 100 million people. That had a 2% death rate, right? What if we had a pandemic infecting billions where death was more like a flip of the coin?
Yeah, that's pretty epic for sure if that were the case. And yeah, look, I know what you're saying. The CDC, it seems, was actually ill prepared in the end. And, there's an article in the New York Times recently about how they just weren't ready for the data provisions and that kind of thing. One thing about you, Doc, which I always love sitting down talking to you is that you're always about the numbers. And I remember last time you were here sitting in the chair, we were talking about diets and I said, look, if you saw the science tomorrow that eating an all-meat diet would save lives, would you do it? And you said, yes, Brian. And so in this case, we see the economic lockdown, shut economies down and put people out of work and that kind of thing. That has a physical cost as well and a death toll associated with that, mental health issues, prison. Have you looked at this from a holistic perspective as well as, okay, the social distancing might save some infection lives, but if it causes more other deaths for economic reasons, I'm sure that must percolate in your scientific brain.
No, absolutely. And I mean, and even the measures you take in terms of social distancing, there's data suggesting that, closing schools, for example, takes so many healthcare workers out of the system because they have young kids at home. And so they don't go to work. And so you'd have to have some extraordinary drop in case rates for school closings to actually result in a net reduction in fatalities, close to a quarter. Now, you can do that with pandemic influenza. Pandemic influenza, school children play a key role in spreading the flu. But for this pandemic, for this virus, kids do not seem to be playing a primary role. So closing school systems actually may result in more deaths later on. But, what you mentioned is even broader. I mean, basically, so for example, childhood vaccination rates around the world have just disappeared. So we're talking about resurgences of polio, resurgences of measles around the world, particularly in the developing South, global South. I mean, we're only just getting a glimpse of the potential death toll, not attributed to the virus itself, but attributed to kind of this global overreaction. But again, look, overreaction at the early stage of the pandemic. If it doesn't look like you're overacting, you're not doing enough, frankly, at the beginning of the pandemic, because there's so many question marks. The problem, it seems, is that once kind of government steps in and puts these regulations in place, it seems to be hard to kind of back out of them. Whereas ideally, we'd be adept enough to look at the science, have the testing in place, to be able to track the disease week to week and be able to say, kind of pump the brakes. Oh, we need more distancing. Oh, we got to close things down again, because to prevent the ICUs, the hospitals from being overrun. And then as soon as it starts lightening up, then at least people at lower risk, without predisposing medical conditions under the age 65 should be able to go out and prevent the kind of economic shutdown that's destroying not only livelihoods, but lives as well in the long run.
Yeah, I had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on here about 4 weeks ago, and he threw out a figure that I think is about right, but he said for every 1% increase in unemployment, it leads to 37,000 deaths and 3,000 people incarcerated, another 3,000 suffering from mental illness. We've seen unemployment spike, I think, 8 or 9%. So if those numbers are right, and I don't know if they are, it shows there's potential, more deaths from the shutdown than the lockdown. And it's just something that I think we need to consider. But when it's times of crisis, nobody wants to think about that. People want to think about, obviously, putting the virus at bay. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's so many ironies. So, for example, one of the most ironic things I came across was that about the drop in air pollution. When China locked down, the air quality is so bad in regions of China that the drop in air pollution from the lack of vehicular use actually saved more lives than the virus was killing. Estimates that we're saving 1,000 lives a day in China thanks to the drop in air pollution. And that was more than were being killed by the. So you can thank COVID-19 for saving lives in China because the air quality was just so bad. So you really have to look at all the factors when you're looking at the implications. But, it's easier, as a politician. If the politicians are running the game, then you always want to err on the side of caution. You don't want to, you're not going to be able to wash the blood off your hands in the next re-election cycle. And so I think there's a natural inborn, reflexive response to always do more rather than less, which And ideally, the politics shouldn't enter into it at all. We should have the public health infrastructure in place to be able to look at the numbers and have the experts really lead us. And that's the one thing that really, in so many countries around the world, just simply did not happen.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of that. And I agree with what you're saying. They want to err to caution for not blood on their hands, but then when the economy's in the toilet, they won't get reelected. So there's so many things to judge. And I agree with you. I think we're just seeing, it's almost as if everyone seems married to these old policies. So, for example, if tomorrow they came out and said, by the way, it's 1 meter social distance. In fact, we want everybody back to work. We're pretty sure this isn't going to pop the R naught over 1. Let's do this, folks. Let's not blame people. If it's the right science, let's do it. And yet it feels like people don't want to look bad. So it feels like this is being dragged out for 4 weeks, 6 weeks. It's like, what are we doing here? And I don't know. I feel that a lot. That, like you said, there's like this political reason for not making more quicker changes. I guess you are too.
I mean, yeah. So, like with the CDC and their mask policy, right? They were very strong. Masks are useless. Don't wear masks. Don't buy masks. And then they had that total 180, and all of a sudden the U.S. Surgeon General is having a little, video talking about rubber banding scarves to their face. And part of that is no one wants, even scientists, look, frankly, don't want to have this confirmation bias. They don't want to seem wrong if they stake out a position. And now positions are public. Right? I mean, now people put it, they tweet something and that's their position and they're going to stick with it. And so they have this kind of part of their esteem, part of their reputation is staked on a particular idea where that's really the antithesis of the scientific process, right? New data, you change policy based on what's coming down the pike. And unfortunately, yeah, we're not seeing that. And frankly, right, we see that in the scientific community, the medical community as well. As staking out some claim and not wanting to retract it, not wanting to seem, it seems stupid, seem wishy-washy, seem spineless. And part of that is just because of our crazy polarization these days, where intellectually it seemed to change one's mind, to flip-flop. Right, that's a negative thing. Where in science, I mean, that's how you tell who's the demagogue and who's the real scientist, because they will take in new science, keep their mind open, and so that's why I so appreciate what you're doing in London Real. Is let's have a diversity of opinions. Look, we have countries that have tried all sorts of things around the world. Let's learn from each other and find out what the best policies are now and in the future.
Yeah, and I have a science background, so in science, you have a hypothesis, you go and do the experimentation, you try to get all the data points you can, and then you come to a conclusion. So, but for us, we've had to go off platform to have these conversations with various doctors who put out points of view, but for them, they're saying the same thing you just said. For them, it's very hard to stick their heads above the parapet and take some shots from people. I had Dr. Rashi Buttar on the other day, and he said, Brian, we're going to get 160 doctors on a Zoom call, and we streamed it live. And he started making statements like, how many people think that, the current social distancing measure is not correct? And they're all putting their hands up. And they all were shocked to see so many doctors put their hands up because they were the ones being quiet for so long. And they felt, obliged to be silent in their doctor's practices and hospitals. And yet a lot of them were thinking the same thing, like, why are we wearing masks? This doesn't make sense. And some of this doesn't seem right. So we've been trying to have this healthy debate, but I'll be honest with you, this has been the hardest chapter of London Real because, quite frankly, the digital platforms are literally shutting me down. YouTube is not allowing me to say these things, to even question things about coronavirus or even talk about vaccines. We're getting flagged and not being allowed to have that discussion, which again seems very strange to me. Does that seem strange to you that we're struggling just to have these conversations?
Well, look, I mean, in the end, this may be a good thing, right? I mean, the more and more we're wedded to these platforms, I mean, when your entire ability to communicate with the world is one fickle platform, and you don't have the backup, you don't have any other way, and you've been year after year, you've just been kind of seduced into that model, and then all of a sudden they pull the plug, then then your ability to communicate with the world could go down the toilet overnight. Whereas now that we're seeing this kind of this uncertainty as to how much people are able to express themselves, it is it's creating an opportunity, a market for these alternatives and other ways for people to communicate. So privacy concerns led to all sorts of this new constellation of apps that allow people, greater security. And so in the end, this may be a good thing in that, we're learning we just cannot trust kind of the powers that be to let people express themselves. Now, look, I mean, as a medical professional, I'm obviously, I don't want people going around telling people to gargle with bleach. I mean, there's certainly a limit you could imagine. But as far as I'm concerned, the best reaction to bad information is more information. You can see, because we now live in an age where there's just so much information that people can get siloed in some crazy spaces and end up with some real tragedies. For example, in Iran, there was some internet rumor that said we should be drinking methanol, wood alcohol, which is poisonous, causes blindness and poisoning. 1,000 people were poisoned, right? Because people were so desperately afraid of the pandemic and they heard this rumor. And so, that certainly gives me pause. And you're like, okay, so what role do these kind of gatekeepers, take when there's, information that's obviously going to potentially harm people? So, I mean, I'm sensitive to that. But as a scientist, both of us, I mean, our default is always more information rather than less.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I love that comment. You said the best antidote, or the best argument for bad information is more information. And yeah, I just love this concept of a healthy debate to kind of move forward. And you're right, we are seeing new platforms, and we're all literally streaming live on one of them now. But also, when there's some big monopolies involved for search and for video, it's still difficult. And look, I've been pretty honest. I've had very frank conversations with YouTube. They've told me literally I'm one upload away from being completely deplatformed. That's 9 years of content, 250 million views. I mean, 5 documentary films, great episodes with you, sir. With great information that literally have saved lives. And yet they're about to let it go because of a community policy that's subjective. And at one point they say, if you're saying anything against the WHO, then we're gonna have to take you down. And I said, but Governor Cuomo of New York City just said to wear masks. And at the time the WHO said not to wear masks. So I said, so he would be deplatformed if he put a video up? And then it just becomes subjective, and then there's a monopoly and $1 trillion company involved, and then we have to seek alternatives. So I'm venting a little my frustrations, but I appreciate your input, Doctor. Where do you stand on some of these things we're seeing, like masks and social distancing? And is this something that you've looked at scientifically as far as what we should do or shouldn't do?
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, that's the 3,600 citations, right? Every study that's been done on masks, particularly these cloth face coverings. That was a new, it turns out, I mean, there's actually a rich literature on that, which I had never read before. So that was very interesting. But the social distancing measures go back. I was talking about social distancing measures back in 2006. Until we know what the primary mode of transmission is, people can go crazy with trying to, disinfect groceries coming into the house. But now we know primary mode of transmission are these respiratory droplets, particularly in confined, crowded indoor spaces. These virus particles exhaled with, it's not just coughing and sneezing, but conversational speech, breath. They do settle out very quickly. You need extended periods. It's not just one little whiff and then you're infected. And so extended periods of close contact with someone who's infectious, again, they don't have to be showing any symptoms. So social distancing measures make sense. The cloth, the face coverings or masks make sense. Of course, not protect you. It's to protect others from you if you're inadvertently infected and infectious. So it cuts down on the number of respiratory droplets that you're spewing out into the world. There's certainly a place for all these. And of course, it depends on your vulnerability. So there's really not kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. And if you look, it's interesting to kind of tie the lifestyle medicine piece together. If you consider the underlying risk factors for COVID-19, right? Heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, obesity. Sound familiar? That's what I've been talking about I've been writing books about for the last 10 years, all of which can be controlled or even reversed with a healthy enough plant-based diet and lifestyle. You know, excess body fat alone dramatically increases one's risk for COVID-19 severity and death at a BMI of 28. The average BMI in the UK is 27.5, so basically being an average Briton. Here in the US, it's 29, so even being skinnier than the average American puts you at nearly 6 times the risk of a severe course. But look, you've been sitting around for months. You can do something about it, right? If there was ever time to start eating healthier, start a meditation practice, start an exercise program. I mean, what have you been doing all this time? This is the time we need to take better care of ourselves, not only protect ourselves from chronic disease risk down the road, but even now from infectious disease risk, and dramatic differences from, you know, healthy people in their 40s and 50s having less than a 1 in 1,000 chance of succumbing to this virus compared to elderly, infirm, sick individuals, with smoking histories, institutionalized setting, having the kind of, case fatality rates we were worried about in the first place. So that population continues to need to be protected, and not just for them, anyone who has contact with them. So I see all these young protesters out in the streets. I'm not worried about them. They're outside. They're, where the ventilation would disperse these viral particles. And even if they are infected, they're young, healthy folks. They're very unlikely to suffer any serious cases. But then what if they're going home to grandparents? What if they're going home to individuals with these comorbidities? And here in the States, communities of color actually have much higher rates of hypertension and diabetes and obesity. And so that is not a good population. How tragic would it be that these expressions of solidarity and justice could lead to potential family tragedy? So there are certain populations continue to need to be protected, whereas the rest of the population can start to get back to normal.
This might sound like a strange question, doctor, but at what point do we have to maybe start holding people accountable for their own health? You know, it's been talked about in this country where it's like, okay, if you decide to smoke and eat poorly and all of these other things, you're now pulling out of the NHS, you're pulling out of the system so much more than someone else. And now you're much higher to be infected for a disease that can now, kill you and draw on the system and hurt other people. Like at some point in the future, will we just say, okay, if you're a healthy person, then you're going to get a cash bonus every week or every month because you're not drawing down on the system? I mean, in here, the NHS, it's real because the government actually pays for that as opposed to, private care in America. But at one point, will we really start looking to our citizens and saying, this isn't a joke anymore. This isn't about just you making a choice. It has consequences on the rest of the society.
Yeah, and so traditionally that's been, the drain on, the capital within the society. So, and whether you have private insurance or not, when people get sick, end up in the ER, it costs all society. It costs all. Someone's paying for that money, but it's even worse. Look, but if it's just your health, and these kind of indirect costs on society, that's one thing, right? It's their body, their choice. They want to go smoke cigarettes and go bungee jumping or something. But it's when that risk transcends themselves. It's your body, your choice. Why not go, drive fast cars? Well, then you could potentially put other people at risk. It's the difference between, putting on your own seatbelt and being able to drive drunk or something. It's now when we're talking about chronic disease, it's largely direct effects on the individual, plus these indirect effects on costs to society. But when it comes to these infectious disease risks, well then, okay, wait a second. Now their bad choices can have effects on their families, on their communities, beyond. Their susceptibility to illness could result in, you being exposed in an elevator when you otherwise might not have been. This is, it's important to get this life-saving, life-changing information about lifestyle medicine into everyone's hands to protect them from all the leading causes of death, regardless of what's happening in the infectious disease sphere year to year.
Let me ask you a question. Say we got you some fundraising and we got you on the ticket and you won the presidency this year, and you can now dictate public policy. And then we take you back in time, and you got to dictate policy for what we should have done in March for lockdown. And maybe you could have said, you know what? If you're under 60 and you're healthy, I want you to go to work, but I want you to stay away from people that are older. I want you to stay away from people with comorbidities. I mean, in the benefit of hindsight, how would you have changed the way we did this lockdown?
Yeah, well, I mean, hindsight's 20/20, obviously. But even based on the information we had at the time, that the scientific community had at the time, there's certainly a much more that could have been done. Actually, President Trump was criticized for his, China travel ban. But I mean, my criticism of that was that it was a more broad ban. Not only was it just on Chinese nationals, it was still letting Americans back from China, but we weren't cutting off, travel from Europe. And in fact, the epicenter here in New York City was seeded not from China directly, but from Europe as well. And that can, again, buy us time. Of course, who cares if we have time if we're going to waste that time, not ramping up, not getting a test that works, which we fumbled terribly here, not having the test and trace infrastructure here to be able to even follow up on cases we find. And so very rapidly, we went from failing to contain the virus to just having to suppress it. And basically this kind of draconian stay at home, stay away from everyone. That is not how all countries in the world dealt with it. And some countries like South Korea, for example, is kind of the typical advantage, was able to retain, with never locked down. Japan never locked down the population. They did try to stop these so-called super spreader events. They continued, even to this day, I believe, to not allow mass gatherings to take place, but was able to keep their economy open. However, even in such cases like Japan, like Sweden, which were able to keep their society open, their economy still tanked. Why? Because every other country was locking down their population. We have such an interconnected global economic system that when the economy of the world grinds to a halt, people can go to work in Sweden, but if there's nothing to export out of Sweden because no one's buying anything, then, it affects us all. And so, I mean, I think one thing we can learn from this is having that the cooperation not only on a national level, but on an international level for data transparency. I mean, there were weeks where China was sitting on this virus and knew there was a new virus, knew there was human-to-human transmission, didn't tell that to the world. All the while, the WHO was praising China's transparency. It was actually the opposite. They were hoping by praising China's transparency, they'd be like, hint, hint, please let us know what this virus is, release the data, release it. And so actually the words coming out of their mouth was the exact opposite. It was all this kind of political jujitsu trying, because the WHO has very little power to actually do anything. All they can do is try to kind of shame countries, or reverse psychology shame countries, or reverse psychology praise countries just to get them to do the right thing. So these are the kind of things we have to work with, because again, the concern with this kind of boy who called wolf scenario, where the next pandemic that comes down the pike and people are like, yeah, been there, done that, I'm not going, no need to lock down. There really is a role for lockdown, social distancing, sheltering in place, real shelter and distancing in place, like they did in some parts of China where you can't go outside, period. There is a role for that in public health, and that is for these really kind of predator-type viruses that are circulating right now in avian populations and poultry populations, have killed hundreds of millions of birds, but have yet locked in the mutations necessary for easy human-to-human transmissibility. But if that happens, then we are going to need the society to kind of embrace these draconian measures, because that's the only thing.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.